Hello everyone, and welcome back. It's been a while, but today we're finally going to talk about Nanite in Unreal Engine. Now, when Unreal Engine 5 was first announced, one of the most exciting features of it was Nanite, the ability to simulate billions upon billions of polygons. Now, I think over the years, it has really delivered on its promise of being able to massively level up what we can come to expect from the 3D fidelity of worlds. That, combined with Lumen, virtual shadows, virtual textures, and a host of other small but really important features, has made Unreal 5 just an absolute blast to use, and capable of delivering some truly incredible environments and games. But I'm all about virtual reality. My question has always been, what's Nanite going to do for VR? Is it going to make us have the ability to have far bigger, far more impressive environments than we previously could? Is it going to give us these incredible, immersive, high-fidelity worlds like we're seeing on flat screen? And initially, the answer, disappointingly enough, was no. It's not ready. It didn't pipe into one of the eyes when it was rendered, and it wasn't really set up for stereo rendering. But that's changed over the last couple of years. First it released, and it was a bit crashy. Then it was updated, and it was more stable. And more recently, it's just been improving and improving. So, to spoil the title of the video, I would say the answer is almost, but it's not precisely there just yet. It still has a little bit of a way to go. So we're going to spin up a couple of basic projects today from assets that have been available on the marketplace, free to download over time, and kind of see what the strengths and weaknesses of Nanite are at the moment. And then we're going to test it by getting a little bit silly at the end. So, first things first, let's grab this factory scene from the marketplace. I think I downloaded this for free a couple of years ago. It might also possibly have been on the permanently free collection, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, it is set up for real-time rendering by default. That's a lot of dynamic lighting we see in there, a lot of dynamic shadow casting, and it's kind of lit in a way that you would have traditionally seen for the last 10 or so years of video game production. But that's not really the way that I would necessarily approach it. So the first thing we're going to do is completely relight the scene. We're going to remove a lot of the filled lights that would have traditionally simulated bounce lighting, and we're going to let actual bounce lighting do all of that work to make it feel slightly more realistic. Now, unfortunately, we still can't really use Lumen or any real-time screen space effects yet for virtual reality, unless you have an RTX 4090 and you're willing to sell the game to about 3 people. So, we still have to rely on baked lighting. Thankfully, there's an incredible tool that's come out over the last couple of years, GPU Lightmass, which makes lighting look a little bit less 2010 and a bit more Octane render. It's really fantastic. So we would be using GPU Lightmass for this scene if it wasn't giving us continuous crashes. This is unfortunately one of its limitations, is if you run out of GPU memory, you're gonna have a fail whilst you try to render the scene. So for this particular scene, we're gonna revert back to traditional baked lighting, whilst I contemplate whether or not I want to buy a more expensive GPU. For now, I'm going to say no. Okay, that's case study 1 complete. We'll return to this a bit later, but in general, all that we've really done is relight the scene so that there's less dynamic lighting, although still some dynamic sun, enabled Nanite on pretty much all of the geometry that we could, and made sure there aren't too many expensive screen space effects, like for example screen space reflections. And that's really it. Now, let's move on to a different type of scene. Now, in some respects, this is a more classic case study of what Nanite's been shown to be very good at. High-resolution rocks and other photo-scanned elements, backed by virtual textures to increase detail resolution when you get close. So this is just a Megascans level. All that we're doing is we're taking a lot of Megascans assets and assembling them together into something that's meant to have really high quality fidelity compared to the kind of rock assets and trunk assets and ground assets that we would have been able to use maybe 2 or 3 years ago for VR. Now, I've built levels like this quite a few times now over the last couple of years, including on some relatively low-end hardware, and they run surprisingly fantastically, but there are a few limitations. Now, it's important to remember that whilst Nanite is absolutely fantastic, it does have a few limitations. In general, this comes down to less about how many triangles you're injecting into the scene, and more about how many different types of meshes or models you're injecting into the scene. So whilst Nanite brings all of its meshes into a shared memory pool for one draw call, it can be a massive and very complex draw call if there's a tremendous quantity of complexity in the scene, less from triangle count and more from the number of different meshes to bring into the pool. So I found being slightly limited in the number of meshes you add into your Nanite system is one way of making it run a bit faster. Usually the base cost is around 4 milliseconds. So despite freeing us in a really massive way, it still in some ways comes back to a draw calls issue, both for flat screen and VR. Anyway, back to the build. You can see that we're just assembling a bunch of pieces, making some cool shapes, having some fun. It really is very relaxed. And then we're going to turn off Lumen and move back to baked lighting. Oh, and let's throw a city in there just for good fun. I remember back in the early days of virtual reality, this city could run in VR, but you really had to set it up in the right way. For a lot of different projects, especially if you had really complicated foregrounds, it was quite an ask. Whereas now, it really has almost no impact on the performance of the level at all. Okay, and let's start running a baked lighting test. Here you can see GPU light mass working as it should be without any memory crashes. Now I have a sneaky suspicion I know why this is, and we'll get to that a bit later, but in general, because this level only has a certain number of meshes, certain number of textures, even if they're held virtually certain number of shaders, it's a lot more efficient than it would have been if it was a hugely diverse level. So there is still a sweet spot for building in VR. You can do really high fidelity, but I would still somewhat be aware of how many different types of meshes you want to throw into a level. You might have more than you could do before, but it's not infinite. Okay, now let's jump into virtual reality for some early tests. I didn't build out this project as its own app, I just did it in editor, so I do apologise for the slight blurriness of the screen cap, but it was running beautifully in engine. I threw in a few little buildings as well that I found from Megascans, and as an experiment I set the sunlight to fully static as opposed to stationary as I usually would, just to test and see how it would look. In my opinion, it's kind of split. Some things are absolutely amazing and a few things are somewhat lacking. So I'll start with the positives. The rocks look fantastic, all of the information is there and you can really see all of the relief and details in all of the geometry, which is something before that was a lot harder to achieve in VR. Still doable if you spent a lot of time doing it, but now you can really just go to town with throwing triangles at the problem, which is nice when you have a time limit. But there was a serious limiting factor as well, and that was a level of kind of blurriness that was almost washed over all of the objects. So that came from two sources. First, that was again because I baked the sunlight as completely static, so there was no real-time shadows, it was all just baked in. And I did that because I felt I'd encountered a shadow casting bug in Unreal Engine 5.2 that was just giving me a lot of issues. And the second issue I find is that for nanite meshes and high-res meshes, you really want to put some time into properly sharpening them using anti-aliasing. So usually Unreal Engine 5 these days recommends temporal super resolution. It's a fantastic way of upscaling renderings, basically similar to DLSS but native to Unreal Engine 5, and it's really excellent. But I find it doesn't necessarily play really well with VR, which has its own resolution and rendering settings. So typically I use temporal anti-aliasing and no temporal upsampling, none of that, just box standard. And then occasionally, if I want to, I might add some kind of sharpening filters. And it doesn't look quite as good as, for example, TSR. Now TSR does kind of work, but if you want to do things like foveated rendering, I find that all of the systems just don't play very nicely together, especially when you need to deal with native rendering resolution settings. So I'm hoping that will be improved in the future. Now, we've seen that you can throw millions upon millions of polygons at a VR scene using Nanite. What about just really big scenes? Let's jump back to that first project that we worked on. Now, as you can see here, it's running. And it's running pretty well, but it's right at the edge. Occasionally from certain directions we have frame hitches, occasionally it just lags a tiny bit. And for VR, you need a rock solid 90 FPS at the very least. So, what's happening here? Well, firstly, maybe you could get some optimizations by using something like foveated rendering, which reduces the overall rendering resolution you need to deal with. The PSVR 2 is really good at this by combining it with eye tracking, so you only render at high res what the player's looking at. But that's not quite enough as well. To me, this is a draw calls issue. Too many materials, too many different types of objects, even though the objects aren't that high res on their own, it's just throwing everything at the scene together and expecting it to be loaded into the frame buffer very quickly. If I was going to optimize this scene for VR, I'd change the way that the textures are read, I'd rebuild the shaders, I'd rebuild the way that things are drawn, and maybe it could run a lot better. I don't think the baseline memory is the issue. Also, there's a lot of particles, so that could also have a cost impact. Now, after everything that I've just said, I don't want you to be disheartened and start to think that actually Nanite can't do all the things that it can do. I'd say that yes, it absolutely can. It really is allowing me as a creator to add more to the world than I would have before. But the thing you have to remember is that when you're running these demos on an RTX 4090, showing these massive worlds on flat screen, they only really need to hit 30 to 60 FPS to meet the criteria of the demo. For VR, at the very least you need 90, and it can go far higher than that. So you have to find a way to use these tools, but really get them to run at ripping fast speeds. And that means you have to be as optimized as possible in other areas, whilst the actual geometry count can still be freed up and heavily uplifted. So this environment I'm showing you now is a good example of this. It's pretty high res, it's using a mid-poly modeling strategy similar to games like Star Citizen, where all of the panels have nice detail, plenty of textures, but it's not going completely over the top. And I feel confident that combined with really good quality baked lighting, I can make environments like this look really fantastic. And I can build them to be bigger and more exciting than I could have done maybe 2 years ago. For context, 2 years ago, maybe if you knew what you were doing, a VR game, you could maybe put 4 million triangles in the scene. Now, using the exact same hardware, I can get upwards of 100 million with no other changes, as long as I'm optimized in all of the other areas. That's massive. Yes, that might not be 50 billion, but that's still like a 10x at the very least, so I love it, I really do. And for me, knowing that the strengths of limitations of Nanite, combined with a good knowledge of shaders, of lighting, of virtual textures, and other scene creation, can make for really, really fantastic looking VR worlds. It just makes making high quality environments a little easier than it was a couple of years ago. And you can have a bit of an uplift. That's a win. That's definitely a win. So I model with a bit more confidence, I design with a bit more confidence, and I uplift areas to have more geometry where they need it, without feeling so worried or constrained about what I'm throwing at the scene. It really is very liberating. And now let's wrap things up with one small final experiment. One of the things I've always wanted to do in VR is spend time in fully immersive dynamic worlds, with as much lighting detail and richness as you can have in the real world. Now, those technologies are on the horizon thanks to companies like NVIDIA doing incredible work with RTX direct illumination, but it's not quite there yet for today. So I decided to run Lumen and some real-time lighting in one of the scenes I built today, just to test it out. I knew I wouldn't get 90 FPS, but if I held my head still on my RTX 2080, which is a great card, but not cutting edge anymore, I wanted to watch a sunset. Why don't you join me for that? Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you soon, hopefully this time less than a year, and take care.